Welcome into another episode of Odd Man Rush. Hope you're all having a great week or weekend whenever you are listening to our podcast across our great country or our great land. I also welcome in our home field advantage listeners as well. As you can imagine, for Odd Man Rush, I'm usually joined by Kyle Diesel. I'm, of course, Will Highland. Um, he was feeling under the weather, so he's not making it in for our trade deadline extravaganza. We'll probably have an episode in the coming weeks. Um, and Diesel usually leads off the program by giving us a weather report. But because of the absence of Kyle, I'm not going to try and take his thunder there, no pun intended, and instead will just dive right into sports topics. So we set our clocks ahead this morning. I'm recording on March 9th, 2025. And that was something that we do every year, and it's scheduled and it's on time and it's very precise. And there's a deadline to that when your clocks will go forward. Your phone knows what to do, your computer knows what to do, oftentimes your car knows what to do. The world sort of moves on. The NHL trade deadline was on Friday afternoon at 3 p.m. Eastern time, Eastern Standard Time, that is. And there's a deadline, and it's literally called the trade deadline in the National Hockey League, and it's quite rigid. But very often news breaks at or after the deadline, and that was the case on Friday, especially with regard to the team that I follow the most, which is the Boston Bruins. So we'll get to that in a minute. But where I wanna start this podcast um, is with the other trades. Now, we talked about originally about the Mikko Rantanen trade, the first one in January. Then there was the JT Miller trade, and then earlier on this week, Trent Frederick was traded um, to the Edmonton Oilers for a couple draft picks, and then it was kind of quiet on the trade front until Friday, or late Thursday, early Friday, and the first of those trades was Mikko Rantanen going from the Hurricanes, where he had just landed 13 games prior, and being shipped to the Dallas Stars. Now, excuse me, there's no way that Dallas imagined that this was going to happen to them. So, Dallas in January was probably pretty happy that Colorado was going to end up without Mikko Rantanen for the rest of the year. And Dallas, in the same division as Colorado, Winnipeg is going to win that division. Then you're going to have Dallas and Colorado playing each other in the first round. So they see their likely first round opponent getting worse. And Mikko Rantanen, who's probably a top 15, 20 player in the league, ending up on the Eastern Conference Carolina Hurricanes, they're thinking, okay, well, that's good news. Then rumblings began to occur really about a month ago that things were just not working out with Mikko in Carolina. And I didn't think the Hurricanes were going to deal him because I think the time for excuse making in Carolina is kind of over. They need to win a Stanley Cup like soon. And and they've been on the cusp, quote unquote, for like 4 or 5 years now. Now, the last two or three, they've really been close. And they haven't been able to get their goaltending in check. Now, adding a top scorer might help with on the front end of those issues. And so it looked like Mikko Rantanen was going to be the guy that possibly got Carolina over the hump. But it wasn't going to work out. He wasn't going to sign there. And Carolina was worried about not re signing him and not winning even with him. Probably. Like, if they were going to take that gamble and then not get anything from him and then maybe not even win the cup. That's smart thinking. The Bruins did not do that 2 years ago when they mortgaged that year, that year's draft essentially, and 2024's draft for Tyler Bertuzzi, Dmitry Orlov, and Garnet Hathaway, and they didn't win the cup, and it hurts. And believe me, we'll get to the Bruins in a minute. Um, so that was the first trade that went down. Was Mikko Rantanen was then dealt from Carolina to Dallas. So Dallas watches Colorado, their division rival, who they're going to play in the first round, get worse 2 months ago. Then they end up with the player that Colorado dealt because Carolina deals Rantanen to Dallas in exchange for two first round picks, a um, a player named Logan Stankoven. Stankoven. I, I I can't do it. I'm not gonna pretend. But you know what I mean. Basically, it's the two first round picks that Carolina gets back. So Carolina, a team that's designed and built to win right now, still has Taylor Hall from that original trade that that included the Chicago Blackhawks. And in Carolina has their work cut out for them in the Eastern Conference, but not as much as those Western Conference teams now that Miko is back in in the Central Division and probably going to face off against his old team in the first round. So that was the first major trade to happen. Second major trade was Brock Nelson going to Colorado. So Colorado, they've got to fill some holes here. And Colorado certainly filled some holes down the middle. They bring in Brock Nelson and a prospect named William DeFore in exchange for Cal Ritchie, a conditional first round pick in 26, a conditional third rounder in 28, and a player named Oliver Shillington, who they just changed or just moved over to Anaheim, a couple hours after. But really, it's Cal Ritchie and the first round pick that the Islanders get back. And Ritchie is considered to be a top tier prospect in the league. And the conditional first round pick in 2026 will certainly help the Islanders and Patrick Waugh as they build toward being a competitive and consistent team. So, Brock Nelson, one of the leaders of that team, ends up on Colorado. And Colorado did a good job of bringing in veterans as well. We'll get to the Avalanche more in a minute when we talk about the Bruins. Third major trade was Scott Lofton going from the Philadelphia Flyers to the Toronto Maple Leafs in exchange for a conditional first and a player whose name I'm going to try and pronounce here, Nikita Grebenkin. So looking at my notes here, Nikita Grebenkin and a first round pick going to Philadelphia in exchange for Scott Lofton. Scott Lofton will help the Maple Leafs down the middle as well. They of course have Tavares and Austin Matthews already. They'll be able to, fit Scott Lofton into that lineup, I think, pretty nicely and have a pretty well balanced team. And Toronto needs that because the Atlantic Division is probably as good as it's been um, in like at least 3 or 4 years. Um, yeah, like the Atlantic Division 2022 was really good. The Florida Panthers win the President's Trophy. The Lightning ended up going to the Cup final that year. You had Toronto, of course, who's good and been good every year, and then the Bruins were the wild card out of that division, and they were no slouch in 2022 either. So that was a really good year. But this year, you're going to get those three playoff teams I just mentioned. You're going to get Toronto, Florida, and Tampa again out of that division, and you're probably going to get Detroit, Ottawa, maybe the Bruins, probably not. Maybe the Montreal, probably not. But you're going to get at least I think one wild card team out of the Atlantic as well. So this is as good as they have been in a long time, and I do think the Maple Leafs are as well positioned to um, be a really deep playoff team as they've been in a long time. And I say that every year, but between Tanev and the other defenseman who they got, which we'll talk about in a minute, plus the addition of Scott Lofton, I think they're poised this year. Plus, they've got youth in places they haven't had youth before. Matthew Nyes is a really good player for them, and he's had a pretty good year. All right, speaking of youth and not getting it done and not being a playoff team, for the 14th straight year, the Buffalo Sabres are going to miss the playoffs. They are a laughingstock of the NHL. I hate to say it because it's a good hockey market. But they have shipped Dylan Cousins, who at one point was going to be the future of their team, and I believe was the um, was involved in the Jack Eichel trade, if I'm not mistaken. Um, they're shipping him to the to the Ottawa Senators, a division rival. Again, the Atlantic, very good still. You're gonna have Ottawa, Detroit, possibly Boston or Montreal sniffing around those wild card spots. Not to mention those other three. And so the rich get richer, and Ottawa deals Josh Norris to Buffalo. Interesting trade. This is more of a hockey trade and not a salary dump or a draft pick centric trade. They ended up swapping defensemen as well, but really it was Josh Norris for Dylan Cousins and a second round pick. And like Dylan Cousins wasn't fitting in Buffalo, and Josh Norris wasn't, um, I guess, in the plans of the Senators going forward. I'm a little bit worried about the Senators and their window to win because I'm starting to think that, I mean, how long does Brady Tkachuk want to stick around in that? I mean, that's a different story. Um, but uh, but I'm not sure. Okay, I wanted to jump back here. Um, Dylan Cousins was not part of the Jack Eichel trade. Um, so I missed that. I'm trying to think of who was part of that trade. I think it was Peyton Krebs and somebody else. Um, but on February 7th of 2023, so about 2 years ago, less than 3 years, but still barely 2 years ago, the Sabres had signed Dylan Cousins to a 7-year contract extension. He was going to be part of their team going forward. They were supposed to be better, and and they ship him and the 5 years remaining um, to Ottawa, and they get Josh Norris and a defenseman named Jake Bernard Docker back. Um, but it's really a whiff on the Buffalo Sabres and what they thought their future was going to be. Dylan Cousins gets shipped to Ottawa, division rival. Ottawa, I guess, willing to part with Josh Norris, uh, and whatnot. It seems very strange to me that trade would go down. That was the most perplexing of the trades not involving the Boston Bruins, was Dylan Cousins for Josh Norris. I think Ottawa and Buffalo are going to be in this state of flux forever, I think. Like, Ottawa looks decent this year. This was supposed to be their coming out party, and they're going to have to fight tooth and nail to make the playoffs. And that was with Linus Ullmark being hurt and with Brady Tkachuk and playing well, and the rest of that team. I'm thinking of Sanderson and some of the other players. It just seems like they have missed the boat there. And so I'm not really sure what they're doing either. I think Dylan Cousins could be a good piece for them, but they're gonna now have to build around him and Brady Tkachuk in a way that is enough to compete with the Tampa, the Toronto, the um, the Florida of their division. And I'm not sure that's going to be enough, and I'm not sure those are the guys are going to want to wait around because you could argue maybe Dylan Cousins is in a better situation now that he's in Ottawa and he's playing with Brady Tkachuk, but I'm not convinced that that's going to be a recipe for success for the Ottawa Senators because I mean Dylan Cousins is practically in the same position he was with Ottawa. He signed a big long deal to be a focal point of that team, and I'm not sure they're going to be able to put enough around them. All right, speaking of focal points of the team, talking about the rest of the league, seemed like the trading deadline was going to cool off a little bit. The Bruins had dealt Brazo to the Wild for a prospect and a prospect whose name, again, I'm not going to try and pronounce, as well as a draft pick. And so, the Wild get their gritty fourth line guy, the Bruins get a draft pick and an NHL roster player slash prospect. All right, that trade happened late Thursday. I'm thinking as a Bruins fan, all right, it's probably going to be somebody that dealt tomorrow. I was thinking a combination of either Coyle or Carlo and maybe Marchand. Under no circumstances. Excuse me, under no circumstances did I believe they were going to trade Brad Marchand, Charlie Coyle, and Brandon Carlo. And in fact, when the Coyle trade broke around 2 o'clock Eastern time, maybe 2:30, somewhere in that frame, I'm like, okay, that was their trade. Pretty solid deadline. You got a lot back for Charlie Coyle. You got Will Zellers, who's a prospect who I think could, at his top, be a second line winger on a good team. He's leading the USHL in goals. Then I was thinking, okay, then you get Casey Middlestat, who I like. He's got 2 years left on his deal after this year. He's another disgruntled Buffalo Sabre, who's going to find success elsewhere. He had played for Colorado this year and hadn't quite materialized for him. And then they also get, I believe, a second round pick. So things had turned out pretty well for the Bruins and this Charlie Coyle trade. So I'm thinking that's a pretty good deadline. You get some picks for Frederick, you get some picks for Brazo, and plus a roster player, bottom six guy. Now you get a prospect, a middle six forward, and a draft pick for Charlie Coyle, who only has a year left after this year. Really good deadline. Because then I'm thinking, okay, in the future, you still have some leaders here. You still have Carlo, you still have McAvoy, both Lindholms. You have Marchand still on the roster for the rest of the year. You've got Pasternak, of course, Pavel Zacha, Swayman, Korpisalo. You've got some pieces next year. Maybe you use some of your cap space now that Coyle's gone, and now that you don't need to go find another middle six forward. Maybe you bring Morgan Geekie back and then go get another scorer in free agency, somebody like Brock Besser. And there you probably on paper have a better team. And maybe Swayman's better next year. And you retool, maybe you extend Brandon Carlo. I'm throwing in a lot of maybes, but that was sort of my feeling at 2:45 on Friday. And then like right at 3 o'clock, the news breaks that Brad Marchand has been traded to Florida. And it was almost comical because the Nesson special, the hosts were unable to contain themselves heading into a commercial break because they knew they were looking down at their phones. The anchors were trying to cut to commercial. It was a major news. Not only that Brad had been traded, but that he'd been traded to Florida and that we weren't sure of the return. Then, when they get back from commercial, news breaks that Brandon Carlo, is being dealt to Toronto for a first round pick and Fraser Minton. And so suddenly the Bruins go from, okay, we're trading Coyle. He's going to be the big piece that we trade. He was attractive to Colorado when we got a good offer for him. And now it goes from, okay, this is a quick roster that might even still try and compete this year because the players going out and the players coming in were sort of a net positive, personally. Casey Middlestat for Charlie Coyle, to me at this moment in time, is kind of even. Then you have Brazo and Frederick for this roster player. Plus, now you're going to be able to maybe play Lysal or Merkulov more. Frederick was hurt anyway. Brazo wasn't playing. Now you've got draft picks. This is the net positive for even for this year. Now you're full on selling. When you trade Carlo and Brad Marchand at the end of the trade deadline with the seconds to go, it goes from a we're just trying to get a net positive out of this season to now we're trying to really build for the future and reshape what the entire roster looks at. Because if they as soon as they traded Brad, I'm thinking, oh well, Carlo's got to be the next captain. If not for McAvoy, Carlo's going to be wearing an A next year. If McAvoy or Pasternak is the captain next year, you're gonna have Carlo wearing the A, and you're probably gonna extend him, and he's gonna be one of your leaders. Now that Brad's gone, and as soon as was formulating that thought, Carlo's traded to Toronto, so you're feeding the Leafs and the Panthers two of your leaders, two of your better players who they know a lot about by being division rivals and playoff opponents the last few years. Um, and they certainly Toronto, as I mentioned earlier, they're going to benefit probably the best of anybody that the Bruins traded with because you're going to get Carlo, who's no stranger to the Eastern Conference playoffs, no stranger to the Florida Panthers and the Tampa Bay Lightning, um, and whoever the wild card is. So like the the nucleus around the Toronto Maple Leafs got better with Brian Carlo. And you can say the same thing about the Florida Panthers, maybe to a lesser degree, that they're going to get Brad Marchand, who is a pain in the ass to play against, and they know a lot about him. And he's won a Stanley Cup. He's been in the playoffs. He's going to help them, um, and whatnot. So there was a lot to be liked about those trades if you're the other teams, and then even if you're the Bruins, up until those two trades, you're really liking your trade deadline. You hear that Marchand's going out the door. You don't know what the return is, but then you hear pretty quickly you're getting Fraser Minton, who's a top prospect in the game, who's NHL ready, I think, next year. I would be surprised if he cracks the roster this year. I think the Bruins also want to get Merkulov, Fabian Lysell, possibly Ryan Mast or Riley Duran into the roster at some point this year. But they're going to have a chance to do that with Fraser Minton now too. So like I think it's a win-win. And plus, you get Toronto's first round pick. Now, at best, it's probably going to be a 24, 25 um, spot pick. But look, I've been hearing for years that the Bruins needed their first round picks. So now they have it. And and then you were waiting on the Brad Marchand return, which is a second round conditional pick from 2027 that could be a first round pick in 2028 if Brad Marchand plays 50% of the games for the Panthers in the playoffs, assuming the Panthers make it to at least the second round. I know that I know it's a little confusing, but if Brad Marchand is in playing for the Florida Panthers enough in the playoffs this year, then it becomes a first round pick. Now, that was the big sticking point for Bruins fans. They were quite upset about the return for Brad Marchand, considering he was your captain. He had been here for 16 years. He won a Stanley Cup. He's one of the best players in franchise history. The list goes on and on. Now he's going to get, if he plays for another team next year, he's going to get his 1,000th career point with another team. That stings a little bit. So people were really hoping that the Brad Marchand return was going to be better than a conditional second rounder. And what what I would say is Brad Marchand's 36 years old. He's had multiple surgeries in recent seasons. He's injured right now, and he's a pending unrestricted free agent. There's a lot of baggage that goes with Brad Marchand right now in this particular. This isn't you're trading Brad Marchand in 2017 when he's a top 10 player in the league and he's healthy and he's 30 years old. You're trading a guy who's much older and probably not getting any faster. Now, is Brad Marchand still capable of being a top six forward on a Stanley Cup winning team? I believe so. Is Brad Marchand better than six forwards currently on the roster for the Florida Panthers? I'm not sure at this moment, especially given his injury status. That team is loaded. It's got Sam Bennett, it's got Carter Verhaeghe, it's got Matthew Tkachuk, it's got um, Alexander Barkov, and it's got Evan Rodriguez. They are loaded, and I think that their forward group is certainly going to benefit from Marchand if Marchand's healthy and playing in the playoffs. That's where he's going to thrive, as I just mentioned. I just wish as a Bruins fan the return was a little bit better, but I can see, look, I was pretty stoked with the return on all those guys up until Marchand. Your return on Trent Frederick was decent. Your return on uh, Justin Brazeau was better than it should have been. Your return on Coyle was better than it should have been, and Carlo got you a first round pick and a top, I'd say probably without knowing a ton about it, maybe a top 20 prospect in hockey. And that's and when I say top 20 prospect, I mean somebody who's under contract already. I'm not talking about like James Hagens or somebody who hasn't been drafted. I just want to make sure that's clear. Somebody that's been drafted, Fraser Minton's, I mean, he's looked at very, very highly, along with like Shane Wright and Ryan Leonard to a degree. Obviously those guys were high draft picks, and I think Fraser Minton was late a late first round or early second round pick. I think he might have gone 38th overall. So actually that would make him an early second round pick. But still, he's looked at pretty strongly. So I'm thinking all these returns are pretty good. Plus you've got Will Zellers, who's, I mean, leading the USHL in goals. He's going to go to the University of North Dakota. He's going to be able to season there for a few years. Then you're going to be able to sign him to an entry level contract, probably in 2028. And he might move in your middle six or play in Providence if he needs more time. So I think the Bruins did pretty well. And then even the Marchand return, I think what's going to happen is the sports radio blowhards around here who only follow the Bruins when it's playoff time or the trade deadline or the off season, okay, when they can get the most clicks. I think they're going to look at the Brad Marchand trade and say, well, we should have got 3 first round picks, or we should have got 2 NHL roster players. And they might be missing the forest for the trees, and that Brad Marchand's 36, and he's had multiple injuries, and he's a pending UFA. Like, I love the guy, but we have to be realistic about what was going on. And it seemed like the Bruins also wanted to do right by Brad Marchand. They wanted to send him somewhere that he was going to win. And it sounded like, according to Elliot Friedman's reporting, that there was only one place Brad was willing to accept a trade, and essentially, and that he asked to go to, and that was Florida. So he's going to be on the East Coast still. And then who knows? We'll see what happens in the offseason. I've been asked a lot the last few days what I think. And I think it's very, very easy at this point. You can have two schools of thought with this trade deadline if you're a Bruins fan. I've talked about the rest of the league. If Diesel was here, we'd talk about the Devils and Jack Hughes' injury and whatnot. But for now, I'm going to focus on the Bruins here, and I'm going to give you a glass half full and a glass half empty. The glass half empty is that Fraser Minton is overrated and not good. Think a Jack Studnicka or a Fabian Lysell, okay? Um, just putting it out there. Or a poor man's, maybe a richer man's John Beecher, okay? That's your glass half empty on Fraser Minton. And then let's say Will Zellers ends up being too small. Excuse me, and he doesn't really hack it in college or in the pros. Then let's say Casey Millstat is a bust and doesn't provide you anything. And let's say those draft picks you get, assuming Don Sweeney is still the GM, it sounds like he's going to be, don't amount to anything, and they end up being more like Zach Shenniston or Jakob Forsbacka Karlsson rather than Brandon Carlo or Charlie Coyle or David Pastrnak. We hear a lot about the bad drafting. that happened in Boston. And for every Jake DeBrusk, Jacob Zaboral, and Zach Senyshyn in the first round, in 2014 they drafted David Pastrnak, and in 2016 they drafted Charlie McAvoy. That is your team right now. Similarly, in 17, you had Trent Frederick, and he was a big part of this team for several years. So, look, and in 2018, you traded your first round pick for Rick Nash, and I think he would have helped you win a cup in 2019 if he had been healthy. And I think his career-ending injury was. I don't think he was going to sign here, and I think he was going to be part of that culture and was going to help you win a Stanley Cup in 2019. So, like some of those drafts around that last time we retooled as a team, that was your 16, 17, 18 era. Like there was hits and misses. So the more realistic scenario than the glass half empty is that it's going to be somewhere in the middle. And then you ask, well, what's the other alternative? The other alternative is that you not only hit on Fraser Minton and Will Zellers, who turn out to be future, players here, got better than Lysell or Merkulov, but they actually end up being parts of this team, like a Jake DeBrusk was, or a Brandon Carlo was back then, or a Trent Frederick. And they're not superstars, but they're solid. Maybe Will Zellers is a superstar. I don't know. Or, in addition to that, Casey Millsat really settles in. He's your second line center you've been looking for. He doesn't cost a ton. He's signed for 2 more years. He fits in here. He was a top 10 pick in his career, and he's part of your team. The same way Pavel Zacha came in and fit in decent alongside good players. Zacha by himself is a little sketchy. Zacha with good players, he's a good player. Complementary piece. And then some of these draft picks, like the first round you got for Toronto, that could be the next David Pastrnak or Charlie McAvoy. So that's the glass half full. And then similarly, I would say beyond that, I think you could package a lot of these picks. I've been saying this. The Bruins are not going to go in full, oh, we're going to tank next year mode either. I think Don Sweeney sees almost 30 million in cap space. He sees the opportunity to remake a roster, and he sees draft capital for the first time in 5 or 6 years where you have considerable draft capital. That could be worth it to somebody with the cap going up and people wanting to clear space. I'm going to float this. I was really hoping to float it to Diesel, but I'm going to float it to you guys. Jack Eichel has 1 year left on his contract after this year with the Vegas Golden Knights. If things go poorly for them in the playoffs, and they might, because the Western Conference is going to be a gauntlet. The Pacific Division has Vegas, it's got Edmonton, they've got the Kings. I think the Central's better, but you still have those teams plus the Flames or the Canucks might sneak in. If it goes poorly for Vegas in the playoffs, then I could see Jack Eichel looking around and saying, okay, I could play 1 more year here in a loaded Western Conference where I'm going to have to get to the Stanley Cup final, go through Edmonton, Dallas, Colorado, Winnipeg, maybe the Kings if they get better, maybe the Predators if they bounce back. Like in the next year in the West isn't going to be any better than this year. Jack Eichel could pull a Matthew Tkachuk, is what I'm saying, and say, I've got 1 year left. I don't really want to sign. So you guys can run it back with me next year. He's got 75 points in 62 games this year. A lot of assists, 20 goals, 55 assists. Jack Eichel could say, I'm ready for a change of scenery, guys. Like, I'm not going to sign you here next summer. I've got 1 year left. I want to be traded. Elias Lindholm did that in Calgary. Then if you're the Bruins, you're sitting there with cap space. You need a 1C. You've got first round draft picks. If you can come to an agreement the same way Carolina and Dallas came to an agreement where Rantanen was going to sign with the Stars long term and then was going to be traded. Matthew Tkachuk did the same thing with the Flames and the Panthers a few years ago. You do that, you sign Jack Eichel to an 8-year deal, get him to come over. He's your 1C of the future. Now the pressure's off. And I would do it. I would do it in a heartbeat. And the reason why I would do it is if you go through next year and you don't have and you're not competing, it's another year like this where you're sort of in the playoff mix and you're not at the same time. It's gonna be really hard. Wow, my Boston accent came out there. It's gonna be really hard. Gonna be really hard for guys like Fraser Minton and Matt Poitras and whoever else is a young guy that you're trying to build into this roster, or a Mason Lowry. It'll be really hard for them to feel good about this roster going forward and their careers going forward. And plus, David Pastrnak and Charlie McAvoy want to win. Hampus Lindholm wants to win. All right, so you are set up. Jeremy Swayman, that's part of the glass half full too. If Swayman has a better year next year, if Hampus is healthy, if some of these guys hit and you're able to fill up the roster, I think the Bruins are still a borderline playoff team next year. If you add Jack Eichel to that mix, you are a playoff team. If your top six is, I don't know, Pastrnak, Coyle, sorry, not Coyle, Pastrnak, Eichel, Zaka, maybe you go in free agency, you get Brock Besser or somebody like, or Jack Roslovic or somebody like that, and then you got Elias Lindholm and Casey Milstad or whomever. I mean, if that's your top six, you're not a Stanley Cup favorite, but you're certainly a playoff team. If your defense can hold up and you get Hampus healthy all year. I mean, people and myself included are worried about the loss of Carlo, but they were a borderline playoff team this year without Hampus Lindholm. I think Lindholm's better than Carlo. If you get Lindholm next year, you've got McAvoy, you've got Nikita Zadorov. Hopefully he's better. Hopefully Elias Lindholm's better. I think if you go forward with that and you add a big player like Jack Eichel who helps reinstall some sort of winning culture here, because now there's nobody on the roster, to my knowledge, who has won a Stanley Cup. Brad Marchand's gone. I don't think there's a single player on the roster at this point who signed next year who's won a cup. There's none. So if you're able to do that, maybe you bring in a guy like Anthony Bolivier or Ryan Donato or somebody else to fill out your middle six on the wing. They're both pending free agents. It doesn't even have to be Brock Besser or Jack Roslovic or somebody that's going to cost more money. Maybe you bring back Brad Marchand. I don't know. But if you can swing a trade for Jack Eichel and use some of this draft capital, I've said this 1,000 times. I would much rather have Jack Eichel and give up a first round pick or a second round pick or more, or some of these prospects, than hope that some 16-year-old kid from Yorkton, Manitoba is going to end up being good someday. Or some kid who plays in the WHL who's 17 and he's 5'9", and maybe his dad played in the league and you're hoping that he ends up being good. Like, we got to stop. We don't do that in Boston. All right? And people are saying this is a rebuild, this is a rebuild. Sure. You can call it what you want. But I do not think that Don Sweeney, after being a buyer for like 8 out of the last 10 trade deadlines, is going to bring this team to the bottom of the league for draft picks. They're not going to be Buffalo or San Jose. They're not even going to be Detroit or Columbus and wait every year to maybe we'll be good next year. Maybe we'll be good next year. Rest in peace. The Columbus Blue Jackets at some point went out and said, Johnny Gaudreau's our guy. We're going to pay him. He's going to be our guy. Think about it's tragic to think about how good that team would be with Johnny. But the Columbus Blue Jackets did that. It's these teams, they go out and spend. The Red Wings bring in Patrick Kane, and weirdly enough, the year they bring in Patrick Kane, doesn't have to be the Patrick Kane from 2014, but Patrick Kane on the Red Wings now, weird, they're now competing for the playoffs. The minute they sign Dylan Larkin to an extension last season and bring in Patrick Kane and push their team forward, suddenly you look at them and they're competing for the playoffs. So if you're the Boston Bruins, my glass half full is you do all those things and you end up with a good team next year. And the cap's only going up. The reality is it's going to be somewhere in the middle. But I do not think this team is headed for a full rebuild. You should be happy about their moves at the trade deadline. And you should be cautiously optimistic about their future. And I think the Bruins, if they've got Pasternak and McAvoy and Swayman and the Lindholms and Mason Lohrei and Matt Poitras turn out to be good and they're signed, for cheap, relatively speaking, contracts going forward, I think you have a nucleus here. I think you've got new prospects like Minton and Zeller that are attractive. You've got guys in the system like Lysel Merkulov, Duran Mast, Mason Langenbrunner, others, Cole Spicer, who've got some future promise a little more than what we've seen. So I would be pretty interested in this Bruins team going forward, and I would not think this is going to be a long process. If they miss the playoffs next year, but they're on the cusp, even if let's say they don't get Eichel and they miss the playoffs and they're on the cusp, but they've got cap space and Eichel's now a free agent, I go for it. Next year's free agent class, whatever it takes. Um, I think this team is still going to be competitive. That's my glass half full. I cannot see them going to the bottom of the league. They might be mid again next year, but I can't see them being on like, Calgary Flames, Seattle Kraken, San Jose Sharks, Columbus Blue Jackets, Utah Hockey Club style. Let's draft, because that's not what the Bruins do. I mean, they traded a guy with a year and a quarter left on his deal, and in Charlie Coyle, and I like Charlie Coyle. He was a great Bruin, but they got back an NHL roster player who's comparable to him, a second round pick, and and a prospect who's probably now their best in the system. So it's like, what are we trying to achieve now? But the Tampa Bay Lightning said we're giving up our first round. I didn't talk about this trade. They're like, we're giving Seattle, you can have our first round picks. We want Yanni Gordon, Oliver Bjorkstrand. Like, we want you on our team, and we want to win the division. We have to compete with Florida and Toronto every year. We don't care about our draft picks. And I think there's a school of thought that that's completely valid in the NHL. It's a hard cap league. It's hard to keep all of your guys. So why not put good NHL roster players on your team every year? I think the conventional wisdom is that the Bruins needed picks, and that's what caused them to be bad this year. I think what just caused them to be bad this year is they had a bunch of guys who were in redundant roles, right? Like, it turned out Elias Lindholm wasn't a $7 million player. You're paying him as a one center. It turned out that uh, Nikita Zadorov isn't a top pair defenseman, and he shouldn't be. But you had an injury that caused him to be. It turns out that maybe Matt Poitras needs a little more time in the AHL. Turns out that maybe Lysell and Merkulov aren't that good. It turns out that, Cass looks pretty good, but he's a fourth liner. It turned out that Max Jones, Cole Koepke, and Riley Tufte or whatever are all kind of the same player as Justin Brazeau. So like that's why the Bruins were bad, is they were just a redundant team. And also, Swayman, I love the guy, but what you paid him for, he wasn't producing you for this year, or producing for you this year. So like that's why the Bruins were bad this year. And I think they took advantage of a seller's market and guys on expiring contracts. They did not trade a player who wasn't under contract beyond, who was, excuse me, they didn't trade a guy who wasn't going to be a free agent anyway a year from now. So they have room on their roster. Don Sweeney's going to have to be aggressive. I think he will be. And I think that's why you should still be okay with the future of this team. The league, people have been asking me, does my Stanley Cup champion change? Um, I'm going to say, I'm going to say no. I don't think my Stanley Cup champion changes. I think I had Edmonton beating Carolina in the Stanley Cup. I think. I think that was my pick. So no, I'm not changing it right now. I'm gonna hold to it. I think the new favorite's probably the Stars or the Avalanche in the West. And then in the East, I think the favorite right now, you have to look at Florida now. More, I know they were kind of up and down at points early on in the year. Got to look at Florida. And you got to look at, I think Tampa is sneaky. All right, that's going to do it for this episode of Home Field Advantage and Odd Man Rush together, combined as one. We're peace, joy, love, and harmony here to end the program. Hopefully, Kyle will be back for our next episode of Odd Man Rush. As always, you can like, share, and subscribe to both wherever you get your podcasts, Apple, Google, Spotify, and Stitcher. You can also follow us on social at Homefield Pod on both X and Instagram. But until next time, my name is Will Highland. This has been Odd Man Rush, and in honor of Brad Marchand, go be a rat.